Thanks for watching Morning Live. Now, South Africa has joined the list of nations instituting drastic measures in light of the coronavirus outbreak. President Cyril Ramaphosa last night outlined measures such as denying a visa to any person who has visited a high-risk country in the past 20 days. He also said that South African citizens returning from high-risk countries will be subjected to testing and self-isolation or quarantine upon return to the country. And to get some reaction to this, we join now by David Van Wyk, who is a lead researcher at the Benchmarks Foundation. Thanks so much for coming through this morning, David.
Thank you very much, Sakina, for having us.
So I see you even have your gloves on. You've got the scarf just in case you need to cover your nose and mouth. What's going on?
Well, I think that I live in the city centre, and so there's lots of door handles, lots of lift buttons, lots of ATM points and so on. All of these are areas where this thing can be transmitted very, very fast. And I think that we need to sanitize all these public areas all the time. The banks really need to sanitize the ATMs on an hourly basis. You know, the pay points in shops and so on should be sanitized all the time. The lifts and lift buttons and so on in the city. The stair railings and so on should be sanitized all the time. You know, you see from overseas the sanitation workers moving through the cities all the time. We should be starting to see that now to prevent this thing from spreading, especially in high density areas. You know, we're very concerned. We work in informal settlements, we work in townships and so on. And in those areas, self-isolation is almost impossible. You know, if you are living in a two-bedroom house or an informal shack, it's very, very, very difficult for you to distance yourself from the people around you and also from the people in that environment, because it's such a high-density environment. And when you come to work in the mornings from Soweto, for example, you have to catch a taxi, and the taxi ranks are a real problem. And you know, the taxis themselves. What are we going to do to protect the taxi drivers? What are we going to do to protect the passengers and so on? We cannot stop the economy. People have to come to work, but coming to work itself is going to pose a major risk for them.
So what is the solution? Because, you know, we spoke off air about social distancing and what that actually means, as you point out, for people who have to commute to work using a taxi or a train or, you know, have to gather in these spaces where they wait for these modes of transport.
Well, we are very concerned that the President's speech was very general, very macro. And people wanted to hear what must they do at a micro level, what must they do at a personal level, besides washing hands and not touching your face and wearing a mask. By the way, masks have not been available in our shops since February. I tried to get masks in Cape Town in the first week of February. Couldn't find any in any of the shops and pharmacies. Johannesburg, the same story. You simply can't find them. And I think that for essential goods, for example, which is very, very problematic, they must ration these things in the shops now, because people with lots of money come in, they just absolutely buy everything. They will empty the shelves, as happened in France and Spain and Italy, and people with no money won't get any of the essential things they need to self-isolate, for example. You know, so we are waiting for the ministers to give what they think the micro issues will be today, and then we will respond to that. We created a hashtag, Stay Free from Corona, and we started that on Friday, and we've got almost 3,000 members already on that, and hundreds of people contributing to it. I think the issue of data is very, very important. We need to actually make data freely available so that the public could actually get access to information. And, you know, having one hotline is not going to be enough. We need to have several hotlines from the government where people could actually engage with. I'm also a bit concerned because we have 1 or 2 hospitals designated per province. So, for example, in the Northwest Province, it's Klerksdorp Hospital. Does that mean that you have to travel all the way from Mafikeng to Klerksdorp? How many people are you going to infect on the way to Klerksdorp? It really, really is problematic. You need to have far more access. We need to identify empty buildings that we could turn into centers for emergency and so on, where we could access people. The Chinese built in Wuhan province 11 hospitals within a space of a couple of weeks. We can't do that, but we've got lots and lots of empty buildings everywhere that we could actually convert into these things.
But do we have the resources to actually attend to it?
Well, I think that we are having a war economy now, and the government should begin to do things by decree. like you would do in a war situation, and actually act in defense of the population. You know, the Constitution says that we've got a right to a healthy and safe environment. That right should now be actually enforced. Absolutely. You see, the problem is that we are now being caught out because in terms of delivery, we've been very, very slack. In terms of the delivery of water, in terms of the delivery of resources and things like that. And now this virus is catching up with us. You know, a lot of people who are responding are saying, how do we wash our hands when we don't have water? How do we do all these things that the government is requiring us to do when we don't have access to basic services and resources?
So looking at, I beg your pardon, some of the far-reaching effects of this coronavirus, taking the economy, for example, let's speak to the areas where you operate, and especially the mining communities, how they are affected and how the mining companies themselves are also being affected by this.
Well, I think that you've got workers going down in cages every day. The cages are packed like this. People are packed up in against it. There's no possibility of social distancing when you go down. Underground, they work under very hot conditions and so on. And when they come back, they come up in that cage again, and then they go back to the informal settlement, because most of the workers who are living on the living out allowance are living in informal settlements like Nkaneng and so on in Marikana. Now, from that very densely packed cage, they will bring that disease back into the community. And in the community, the only forms of entertainment they have are shebeens. And shebeens are packed like this as well. There's no other recreation that is available to these communities. My biggest fear is, let's say someone has traveled overseas for the mining company, comes back into the company, he goes underground with workers, he infects that whole cage, and people go back into the informal settlement. Once it's in there, it might become completely uncontrollable. You see, these micro things are the things that we actually need to pay attention to. We say that we're closing schools on Wednesday. Who's going to take care of children while the parents are at work? You know, people go to work, they leave the children at home. That's going to be a huge, big problem. And at work, you contract the virus, you bring it back to the kids. On the other hand, you leave the kids at school, they bring it back into the home. So these dynamics and things like that really needs very careful attention, and it needs to be thought through so that we don't have unintended consequences where a solution actually becomes a problem in the future.
So I was reading an article yesterday about the economic impact of this coronavirus. But speaking to the area where you work, the Marikana area amongst others, the impact on mining companies in that area?
Well, I think that the mining industry is in trouble as it is, because you've had a collapse of commodity prices over the last couple of weeks. As it is. You know, fortunately for those who mine platinum, they've got huge stocks of platinum in reserve, which they can actually continue to sell even if the mines stop operating. What we would like to see is for there to be a shutdown in this industry, a complete shutdown until such time as this virus has passed, because these are communities that are very dense and very large numbers of people will be affected by them. But in that process of the shutdown of the industry, they can start selling off the reserves, so that by the time that the virus has passed, you can now actually begin to sell from a point where there's actually more demand than supply. At the moment, you've got in platinum, for example, more supply than demand for platinum, and the platinum price has been very low. The gold price has been collapsing as well, strangely, because usually the gold price rises in times of crisis. What we've seen in the United States is the bailout of banks to the amounts of trillions of dollars. Now, within the South African context, the banking industry is very closely associated with the mining industry. So we need to see what we can do as a society with regard to that, because that will have a ripple effect throughout, right down to the household level, where people won't be able to pay their rent, they won't be able to pay their mortgages, they won't be able to pay their bank loans and so on. And so we need to see what we can do to protect workers, to protect ordinary people and so on from the impact of this thing. So in a war economy, for example, in the Second World War in Britain, the tax was 100% on profit. Now, what we need to do here is to create an extraordinary situation where the state can access resources by decree in order to protect the population from the impact of this thing.
How do you think that's going to go down with the captains of industry?
Well, the captains of industry will just have to bite the bullet, because it is better to come out of this thing without all the negative impact and then restart the economy on a healthy basis than what we come out of it with a prolonged crisis over a long period of time. That's why we've been calling for the last 2 weeks, we've been asking for the state to take action, take action, take action. Tell the public what you're going to do. Tell the captains of industry what you're going to do. Inform the people. Now, the president's speech last night was very good, even though it was very broad. It was much better than that of Donald Trump. It was much better than that of the British Prime Minister, but it lacked detail, and we hope that the detail will come out today.
Now, when you speak to the situation in the platinum sector, as you say, commodity prices have been falling. But if they were to follow your suggestion and say, shut down the industry and sell off the reserves in the meantime, will that not exacerbate the jobs bloodbath that we're already witnessing?
Well, I think that jobs need to be secured. I think that the government needs to tell industry that no one gets fired in all sectors, not just in the mining sector. You should actually send your workers home on paid leave, and then after the crisis we can resume. You know, for the metals industry it will be a good thing, because the levels of surpluses in metals globally will be dealt with, and the prices of all these commodities will begin to rise as soon as the global economy begins to recover, because there will be a shortage of supply. But if you continue just supplying, even in the crisis, you're not actually going to recover the prices or the market for these minerals.
So if it's that obvious, why isn't it being done?
Well, I think that, you know, in our context, we have solutions that are always kind of middle class and upper class. We don't look at the ordinary people on the ground, and we don't understand that wealth is actually created by work. And we've got to protect work more than anything else. If we don't protect work, we are going to have a crisis in the future, because it's work that creates value.
So, David, also just looking at some of the travel restrictions imposed, what do you make of that? How's that likely to affect this already ailing economy?
There are two problems for me. We didn't close all the ports, and so the export ports are still running. And in Italy, it was the cloth industry from China that actually hit Italy. They continued the exchange of cloth from China and Wuhan province particularly, and so Italy is particularly hard hit. We are exporting to China iron, we are exporting a whole range of other minerals to China as well through those ports, and those export ports will remain open as far as I understand the president's speech. And that for me is problematic, because those port workers, many of them also come from informal settlements and townships and high density areas, and if they get impacted, it will impact on those people as well.
So, talking about social distancing, being here, schools, tertiary institutions closing, gatherings of people limited to 100. What's going to be the impact of all of that when we have people sitting at home? What are they going to do? Because not all companies will be in a position where they can say you can actually do your work from home.
Well, I think especially those companies that actually produce goods, you know, the people who produce paperwork and so on can work from home very easily. I think social distancing for me is a problem. We should actually call it physical distancing, especially in a country where we've got such big social divides already in terms of income and resources and so on. And social distancing in poor communities is absolutely impossible to maintain in any case. So even if you send people home, they won't be able to maintain that 2 or 3 meter distance that is required in the communities where they are living. And in any case, what we have as a result of this apartheid spatial arrangements of people is that people in those townships very often have to travel to town to buy things. You know, so they have to go to town to get these essentials that are required for self-isolation, and so they are really in a catch-22 situation. You know, the apartheid divide is also what makes it very difficult for our economy, because people have to travel by taxi to work over quite a long distance every day, and so we're paying a heavy price for not having changed the social arrangements of apartheid, the spatial arrangements of apartheid in the society over the last 25 years.
And, you know, we talk and we reflect upon government's interventions. What about companies themselves? Are they doing enough?
Well, I think that this is very important. You know, bank tellers, people who are working at pay points in supermarkets and so on, these people need to be protected. They need to be given masks. They need to be given gloves. They need to be given sanitizing sprays. They need to sanitize the pay points and so on regularly, because they are the people who are most at risk, really, because they're right in front of this struggle against this particular virus. And you know, in Spain, they've now banned all gatherings of more than 5 people. In the South African context, that's almost impossible, because in many households you have multiple members of families staying together from different generations, and in very small and limited spaces. Again, we come back to the spatial arrangement, where people in the past thought that the working class don't need space. You can just squash them into little matchboxes. And we are going to pay a heavy price because of that as well, you know, that disrespect for the people who work in this country.
And then, of course, the issue of sanitizers, amongst others. As you said, some people are stockpiling, those who can afford to do so. And we heard you said the masks since last month already not available, and that situation continues. But even sanitizers have been sold out. So what's to be done?
Well, I think that we're going to have to import these things on a massive scale very quickly. But we're closing all the borders for things to come into the country at the moment. So we're going to have to look at the South African business sector actually stepping up. And again, I go back to the Second World War. You know, most of the mines transformed their workshops into munitions factories. Now we can get a situation perhaps where the private sector can change their workshops into manufacturing masks and things like that on a massive and very rapid scale. You know, we actually have to all think patriotically at this particular stage. What are we going to do to ensure that our country is not so badly affected as China was, or as Italy is at the moment? And we are at very high risk because of the social conditions that we find in this particular country. In Africa, we will probably be the worst hit.
And of course, just a final word on those who feel that this is much ado about nothing, not quite taking it seriously. How do you get through to people? How do you convince them that this is really a serious issue?
Well, I live in Loveday Street, and there are a couple of clubs just below, and these clubs were running until 3-4 o'clock this morning. And so people were packing in there, they were dancing, there was no physical space maintained and so on. People are almost living as if this thing is not going to affect us. And we saw in Italy, it started with 1 case, it rapidly jumped to 1,000 cases, and then it just went skyrocketing. In South Africa, we saw last week 2 weeks ago 1 case, and we're now at 61 cases. By tomorrow, we might be at 120, and by next Wednesday, we might be more than 1,000. And then you're going to see the health facilities, the public health facilities themselves, which also are not up to standard at this particular point, being overrun.
Well, hopefully people are listening and are taking this seriously. David, thanks so much for stopping by. David Van Wyk is, of course, the lead researcher at Benchmarks Foundation, talking to us about the coronavirus outbreak. Of course, they were very vociferous at the forefront of calling for drastic measures to be taken by government, and that was also their reaction to last night's announcement by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Well, at 7 o'clock, let's bring you the latest news.